The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Clearwater Valley as Jake Morrison stepped out of the Silver Dollar Saloon. His boots hit the wooden sidewalk with a confident thud, spurs jingling with each step. Behind him, three other men emerged from the dim interior, their laughter echoing off the storefronts that lined the street. "Did you see that old fool trying to fix his fence yesterday?" Jake called out to his companions, his voice carrying the arrogance that had made him both feared and despised in equal measure throughout the small town. "That Cherokee thinks he can make it out here with the rest of us real ranchers." Tom Bradley, a heavy-set man with a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face, spat into the dirt. "Don't know why the bank even gave him that loan. Everybody knows his kind ain't cut out for this kind of work." The third man, Pete Lawson, adjusted his hat and nodded in agreement. "My grandfather fought against them savages back in the day. Crazy to think one of them would try to set up shop here, acting like he belongs." Rick Coleman, the youngest of the group at barely 25, kicked at a stone in the road. "Maybe we should pay him a visit, show him he ain't welcome here." Jake's eyes lit up with a cruel gleam. "Now it's thinking, Rick. That Cherokee needs to understand this valley belongs to folks who've earned their place here." The four men had been causing trouble for anyone who didn't fit their narrow view of who belonged in Clearwater Valley. They came from families who had settled the area decades earlier, and they believed this gave them the right to decide who else could call the valley home. Their latest target was Samuel Running Bear, a Cherokee man in his 50s who had purchased a small ranch on the outskirts of town just 6 months ago. Samuel had arrived quietly, keeping to himself and working his land with a determination that impressed even some of the more reasonable townspeople. He had a weathered face that spoke of years spent under the sun, hands that were calloused from honest work, and eyes that held both wisdom and sadness. Despite his quiet nature, there was something about Samuel that commanded respect, though Jake and his gang seemed determined to ignore it. The general store owner, Martha Henderson, had mentioned to her husband just the night before that Samuel was always polite when he came to town for supplies. He paid his bills on time, never caused any trouble, and even helped old Mrs. Peterson carry her groceries to her buggy the previous week. But Jake and his friend saw none of these qualities, choosing instead to focus on the fact that Samuel looked different from them and came from a different background. As the four men walked down the street, they passed the barber shop where Henry Walsh was cutting the hair of Dr. Michael Foster, the town's only physician. Through the window, they could see the two men deep in conversation. "I tell you, Henry," Dr. Foster was saying as the barber worked, "that Cherokee fellow knows more about healing plants than half the doctors I studied with back east. He helped young Billy Turner with that infected cut on his arm when I was out of town last week. Used some kind of poultice that cleared it up better than any medicine I could have prescribed." Henry nodded thoughtfully as he snipped away. "My wife mentioned something about that," said Sarah Turner was mighty grateful. "The boy's arm was looking pretty bad there for a while. Makes you wonder what else he knows," Dr. Foster continued. "I heard from Jim Patterson that Samuel helped fix his irrigation problem too. Showed him some technique that got water flowing to parts of his property that had been dry for years." But Jake and his gang didn't hear these conversations. They were too focused on their own prejudices to notice the good that Samuel was quietly doing around the community. Instead, they continued their march toward the edge of town, their minds set on harassment and intimidation. Samuel's ranch lay about 3 miles from the main street, nestled in a valley between two gentle hills. The property included a modest wooden house, a barn that had seen better days but was structurally sound, and about 200 acres of grazing land that backed up to a small creek. When Samuel had first seen the property, he knew it was exactly what he'd been looking for, a place where he could raise cattle, grow some crops, and live peacefully. The house itself was simple but well-built, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front and one side. Samuel had spent considerable time repairing and improving the structure, replacing rotted boards, fixing the roof, and painting the exterior a warm brown color that blended naturally with the surrounding landscape. He had also installed new shutters on the windows and built a small garden beside the house where he grew vegetables and medicinal plants. The front door of the house was made of solid oak, weathered but strong. To most people passing by, it would look like any other ranch house door. But carved discreetly into the wood near the bottom right corner was a small symbol that held deep meaning for Samuel and his people, a Cherokee marking that represented protection, strength, and connection to the ancestors. As Jake and his gang approached the ranch, They could see Samuel working in his corral, training a young horse. The animal was a beautiful chestnut mare that Samuel had acquired from a traveling horse trader a few weeks earlier. She was spirited but intelligent, and Samuel was using gentle, patient methods to earn her trust. "Look at him playing with that horse like it's a pet," Jake sneered as they rode closer. Real ranchers break horses proper, with force and authority. Tom Bradley pulled his horse to a stop about 50 yards from the corral. "Should we ride in and tell him what we think of his methods?" "Let's just watch for a while," Jake decided. "I want to see him make a fool of himself when that horse throws him." But Samuel didn't get thrown. Instead, they watched as he worked with quiet confidence, speaking to the mare in low, soothing tones. He moved slowly and deliberately, allowing the horse to become comfortable with his presence before attempting any training exercises. Within an hour, he had the mare responding to basic commands and even accepting a saddle. Rick Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "He actually seems to know what he's doing." "Don't let it fool you," Jake replied sharply. "Horse training ain't the same as running a real ranch. Wait until winter comes and he's trying to keep his cattle alive in the snow. Then we'll see how much he really knows." Pete Lawson pointed toward the pasture behind the house. "Speaking of cattle, looks like he's got himself a pretty decent herd started." Indeed, Samuel's pasture held about 30 head of cattle, a mix of breeds that he had carefully selected for their hardiness and adaptability to the local climate. The animals looked healthy and well-fed, grazing contentedly in the afternoon sun. "Probably bought them with money he got from the government," Tom muttered. "You know how they give handouts to his people." This was another false assumption on Tom's part. Samuel had actually purchased the cattle with money he had saved from years of working as a guide and translator for various government agencies and private companies. He had a reputation for honesty and reliability that had served him well in those positions, and he had been careful to save every penny he could toward his dream of owning his own ranch. As the afternoon wore on, the four men continued to watch and criticize everything Samuel did. When he repaired a section of fence, they complained that he was doing it wrong. When he checked on his vegetable garden, they mocked him for growing women's crops. When he carried water to his horses, they laughed at his primitive methods. But their laughter died down when Samuel suddenly straightened up and looked directly at them. Even from 50 yards away, they could feel the weight of his gaze. There was no fear in his eyes, no anger, just a calm assessment of the situation. He studied them for a long moment, then turned back to his work as if they weren't worth his time. "Did you see that?" Rick whispered. "He looked right at us like he wasn't afraid at all." "Course he ain't afraid," Jake replied, though there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "He don't know what we're capable of yet." The truth was that Samuel knew exactly what they were capable of. He had dealt with men like Jake Morrison before in other towns and other places. He had learned long ago that the best way to handle bullies was to show no fear while also avoiding unnecessary confrontation. He hoped that if he ignored them, they would eventually lose interest and find someone else to harass. As evening approached, Jake finally decided they had spent enough time watching. "Come on, boys. Let's go introduce ourselves proper-like." They rode their horses right up to the fence around Samuel's property, deliberately trampling some of the wildflowers that grew along the border. Samuel was now working near his barn, organizing tools and equipment for the next day's work. "Hey there, Cherokee," Jake called out in a voice loud enough to carry across the entire property. "We thought we'd come by and welcome you to the neighborhood." Samuel looked up from his work, but didn't move toward them. "Afternoon," he said simply. "Name's Jake Morrison," Jake continued. "These here are my friends Tom, Pete, and Rick. Our families have been ranching this valley for more than 30 years. "Samuel Running Bear," came the quiet reply. "Running Bear, huh?" Pete laughed. "That's a mighty interesting name. You planning on running somewhere anytime soon?" Samuel's expression didn't change. "I plan on staying right here." "See, that's what we want to talk to you about," Jake said, dismounting from his horse and walking closer to the fence. "This valley's got a certain way of doing things. Traditions, you might say, and we're not sure you understand how things work around here." "Understand plenty," Samuel replied evenly. Tom Bradley also dismounted and joined Jake at the fence. "Do you now? Because from what we've seen, you've got some pretty strange ideas about ranching. Playing with horses instead of breaking them proper, growing vegetables like some kind of farmer, using methods that ain't been tested by time." "My methods work fine," Samuel said. "For now, maybe, Rick chimed in from his horse. But what happens when the real challenges come? What happens when you've got wolves threatening your cattle, or rustlers looking to steal what you've worked for, or winter storms that test everything you think you know? Samuel finally set down the harness he had been mending and walked closer to the fence. As he approached, the four men got their first good look at him up close. He was taller than they had expected, probably 6 feet or more, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean muscle that came from years of hard physical work. His face was lined but strong, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that made them all slightly uncomfortable. "I've faced wolves before," Samuel said quietly, "and rustlers, and winters that would freeze the breath in your lungs. I've faced things that would make grown men run, crying to their mothers. So don't worry yourselves about whether I can handle the challenges of ranching in your valley." There was something in his tone that made even Jake take a step back. It wasn't a threat, exactly, but there was an underlying strength and confidence that suggested this was not a man to be trifled with. "Well," Jake said, trying to regain his composure, "we'll just have to see about that, won't we? This valley has a way of testing newcomers, especially ones who think they're better than the folks who've been here all along." "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Samuel replied. "I just want to work my land and live in peace." "Peace," Tom repeated with a snort. "That's a fine sentiment. But peace has to be earned around here. Has to be deserved." Pete nodded in agreement. "Can't just show up somewhere and expect to be welcomed with open arms, especially when you're so different from everyone else." Samuel looked at each of them in turn, his expression still calm, but his eyes growing harder. "Different how?" The question hung in the air for a moment. None of them wanted to say outright what they meant, but the implication was clear enough. "Just different," Jake finally said. "Different ways, different background, different everything." "I see," Samuel said softly. "And I suppose you think that gives you the right to decide who belongs here and who doesn't." "We don't decide nothing," Rick protested. "The land decides. The community decides. And sometimes the community decides that someone just doesn't fit in." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying their faces. Then he nodded slowly. "I understand what you're telling me, and I appreciate you taking the time to ride out here and make your position clear." Jake smiled, thinking he had won. "So you'll consider moving on? Finding somewhere more suitable?" "No," Samuel said simply. "I'll consider that you've had your say, and now you can ride back to town and leave me to my work." The smile faded from Jake's face. "You might want to reconsider that answer. Cherokee, this valley can be a mighty unfriendly place for folks who don't know their place." "Is that a threat?" Samuel asked, his voice still calm, but carrying a subtle edge. "It's just friendly advice," Jake replied, "from one rancher to another." Samuel nodded again. "Well, I appreciate the advice. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to finish before dark." He turned and walked back toward his barn, dismissing them as completely as if they had never existed. The four men stood there for a moment, uncertain how to respond to such casual dismissal. "That's it," Rick called after him. "You're just going to ignore us?" Samuel stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "I'm not ignoring you. I heard everything you said, but I have cattle to tend, equipment to maintain, and about a dozen other things that need doing before tomorrow. So unless you're here to help with the work, I suggest you head back to town." Jake felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. No one dismissed him like that, especially not some Cherokee who thought he could just waltz into their valley and act like he owned the place. "You're making a mistake, Running Bear," Jake said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "A big mistake." Samuel turned to face them fully, and for just a moment, something flickered in his eyes that made all four men feel like they were looking at something far more dangerous than a simple rancher. "Maybe," Samuel said quietly, "but it won't be the first mistake I've made, and it probably won't be the last. The difference is I learn from my mistakes." "Do you?" With that, he disappeared into his barn, leaving the four men standing by the fence feeling confused and angry and somehow smaller than they had when they arrived. As they mounted their horses and rode back toward town, Jake's mind was already working on ways to make Samuel Running Bear regret his decision to stay in Clearwater Valley. He didn't know yet about the Cherokee mark on Samuel's door, or what it represented, or why Samuel Running Bear was not the easy target he appeared to be. But he would learn soon enough. 3 weeks passed after Jake Morrison and his gang's first visit to Samuel Running Bear's ranch. During that time, the four men made good on their promise to make life difficult for the Cherokee rancher. It started small, tools going missing from Samuel's property, fence posts mysteriously loosened in the night, and cattle occasionally wandering into the road through gates that had somehow come unlatched. Samuel noticed all of these incidents but said nothing. He simply fixed what needed fixing, replaced what needed replacing, and continued with his work. His calm response only frustrated Jake and his friends more. They had expected anger, fear, or at least some sign that their harassment was having an effect. It's like trying to rile up a stone statue. Pete complained as the four men sat around a table in the Silver Dollar Saloon one evening. Nothing we do seems to bother him at all. Maybe we need to step things up, Rick suggested, taking a long drink from his beer. Show him we mean business. Tom Bradley nodded enthusiastically. I say we ride out there and have a more direct conversation with him. Make it clear that our patience is running thin. Jake leaned back in his chair, considering. He was frustrated too, but something about Samuel Running Bear bothered him in a way he couldn't quite explain. The Cherokee had shown no fear during their first encounter, and that confidence suggested he might be more than he appeared to be. Let's give it another week, Jake decided. Keep doing what we're doing, maybe add a few more inconveniences. If he still doesn't get the message by then, we'll pay him another visit. What Jake didn't know was that Samuel was far from oblivious to their campaign of harassment. He had decades of experience dealing with similar situations, and he recognized the pattern. The missing tools, the loose fence posts, the open gates, it was all designed to be just annoying enough to be frustrating, but not serious enough to involve the law. Samuel had actually been expecting something like this from the moment he decided to settle in Clearwater Valley. He had heard the whispers when he first arrived, seen the suspicious looks, felt the tension whenever he came to town for supplies. He knew that some people would never accept him, no matter how quietly he lived or how hard he worked. But Samuel Running Bear had not survived 53 years and traveled thousands of miles just to be driven away by a few small-minded ranchers. He had faced much worse than Jake Morrison and his friends, and he had learned long ago that the best way to deal with bullies was to be patient, prepared, and stronger than they expected. The truth about Samuel's past was something that Jake and his gang could never have imagined. Samuel Running Bear was not just any Cherokee trying to make a new life as a rancher. He was a decorated veteran of conflicts that most people had never heard of, a man who had served his country in ways that would never be written about in newspapers or commemorated with parades. Samuel had been born in North Carolina, but his family had been forced to move west when he was still a young boy. His father had been a Cherokee leader who had tried to find peaceful solutions to the conflicts between his people and the expanding white settlements. When those peaceful solutions failed and removal became inevitable, Samuel's family had been among those who had made the long, difficult journey to Indian Territory. During that journey, Samuel had learned lessons about survival, resilience, and the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves. His father had died during the second winter in the new territory, worn down by the hardships of displacement and the stress of watching his people struggle to rebuild their lives. Samuel's mother had raised him with stories of their ancestors, teaching him the old ways while also preparing him for life in a world that was rapidly changing. She had insisted that he learn to read and write in English, while also making sure he understood Cherokee traditions and values. By the time he reached adulthood, Samuel was equally comfortable in both worlds, a skill that would serve him well in the years to come. When the Civil War broke out, Samuel had faced a difficult choice. Many Cherokee had sided with the Confederacy, believing it offered them the best chance of protecting their autonomy. Others had remained loyal to the Union, hoping that federal victory would lead to better treatment for tribal peoples. Samuel had chosen to serve as a scout and guide for Union forces, using his knowledge of terrain and tracking to help soldiers navigate unfamiliar territory. But Samuel's military service had not ended with the Civil War. For the next 15 years, he had worked with various army units in conflicts with hostile tribes, railroad surveys, and mapping expeditions throughout the Western territories. He had earned a reputation for reliability, courage, and an uncanny ability to anticipate trouble before it arrived. During those years, Samuel had seen more violence and hardship than most men could imagine. He had tracked raiders across hundreds of miles of desert, survived ambushes that killed most of his companions, and negotiated truces between groups that had been enemies for generations. He had learned to fight when fighting was necessary, but more importantly, he had learned when not to fight. By 1885, Samuel had grown tired of the constant movement and conflict. He had saved enough money to buy his own land and wanted nothing more than to settle down somewhere peaceful and raise cattle. When he heard about the ranch for sale in Clearwater Valley, it had seemed like exactly what he was looking for, a quiet place where he could live simply and leave his violent past behind. The Cherokee mark carved into his front door was more than just a decorative symbol. It was a recognition sign that identified him to others of his people as someone who had earned honor and service to the community. The specific pattern of lines and curves indicated that Samuel was a warrior who had also served as a peacemaker, someone who had fought when necessary, but had always sought nonviolent solutions first. Most white settlers would never recognize the mark for what it was, but to those who understood Cherokee traditions, it spoke volumes about Samuel's character and capabilities. Unfortunately, Jake Morrison and his friends had never bothered to learn about the cultures of the people they so casually dismissed. As the harassment continued, Samuel began to prepare for the possibility that it might escalate beyond mere pranks and inconveniences. He cleaned and oiled his weapons, made sure his horses were always ready to ride, and began paying closer attention to the movements of his cattle and the condition of his property. Samuel also started making subtle inquiries around town, learning more about Jake Morrison and his associates. What he discovered painted a picture of four men who had never faced any real challenges or consequences for their actions. They came from established families, had never served in the military, and had spent their entire lives in the comfortable bubble of Clearwater Valley. Jake Morrison was the son of a successful rancher who had built his fortune during the cattle boom of the 1870s. Jake had inherited both land and money, but had never had to work particularly hard for either. His sense of entitlement came from growing up believing that his family's success made him superior to others. Tom Bradley was the youngest son of a large ranching family. He had never been given the same responsibilities as his older brothers and had spent most of his adult life drinking and causing trouble. His prejudices were simple and crude, based on ignorance rather than any real experience with people different from himself. Pete Lawson's grandfather had indeed fought in various Indian wars, but Pete himself had never seen combat or faced any real danger. He clung to his grandfather's stories and used them to justify his own hostility toward Native Americans, even though he had no understanding of the complex realities those conflicts had involved. Rick Coleman was the youngest and, in many ways, the most impressionable of the group. He had fallen in with Jake and his friends because they offered him a sense of belonging and importance that he had never found elsewhere. His participation in their harassment campaign was motivated more by a desire to fit in than by any deep-seated prejudice. Samuel understood all of this, just as he understood that the harassment would likely continue to escalate until something forced it to stop. He hoped that Jake and his friends would eventually lose interest and find other targets, but he was prepared for the possibility that a more direct confrontation would become unavoidable. The confrontation came sooner than expected, triggered by an incident that had nothing to do with Samuel, but everything to do with the character of the men who were harassing him. It was a Saturday afternoon in early October, and Samuel had ridden into town to pick up supplies and check on a shipment of feed that was supposed to have arrived from Denver. As he tied his horse to the hitching post outside Henderson's general store, he heard raised voices coming from the barber shop across the street. Through the window, he could see Jake Morrison standing over a young boy who was cowering in the corner. The boy was maybe 10 years old, thin, and poorly dressed with the dark hair and features that suggested he might be Mexican or perhaps part Indian. "I told you to stay away from here," Jake was saying, his voice loud enough to be heard through the glass. "Your kind ain't welcome in decent establishments." Henry Walsh, the barber, was trying to intervene. "Now, Jake, the boy ain't done nothing wrong. He just came in asking if I had any work he could do for a few pennies." "That's the problem," Jake replied. "These people need to learn that they can't just go wherever they want, asking for handouts from hardworking folks." Samuel pushed through the door of the barbershop just as Jake grabbed the boy by the collar and started dragging him toward the exit. The child was clearly terrified, tears streaming down his face as he struggled in Jake's grip. "Let him go," Samuel said quietly. Jake stopped and turned, his face lighting up with malicious pleasure when he saw who had spoken. "Well, well, if it isn't our Cherokee friend, come to rescue another savage." "He's just a child," Samuel replied, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge that made Henry Walsh step back toward his counter. "A child that needs to learn his place," Jake said, "just like certain other people around here." Samuel took a step closer. "I said let him go." For a moment, Jake considered pushing the confrontation further. But something in Samuel's posture, the way he held himself, made Jake reconsider. Instead, he shoved the boy roughly toward the door. "Get out of here, kid, and don't come back." The boy stumbled, but caught himself and ran toward the door. As he passed Samuel, the Cherokee rancher caught his arm gently. "Are you hurt?" Samuel asked in Spanish. The boy shook his head, wiped his eyes, and whispered, "Gracias, senor." Samuel nodded and watched as the child disappeared down the street. Then, he turned back to face Jake, who was watching the exchange with growing anger. "Real touching," Jake said sarcastically. "Maybe you two can be friends back in whatever hole you crawled out of." "The boy did nothing wrong," Samuel said. "He was just looking for honest work." "Honest work," Jake repeated, "from someone who probably don't even speak proper English. Someone who's got no business being in a white man's barbershop." Henry Walsh cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Jake, maybe we should stay out of this, Henry," Jake snapped. Then, he turned back to Samuel. "Seems like you got a real problem with understanding how things work around here. Cherokee, maybe it's time someone explained it to you more clearly." Samuel studied Jake's face for a long moment. "I understand perfectly. You think being born here gives you the right to decide who else belongs. You think your skin color makes you better than people who look different from you. And you think that because you've gotten away with bullying others, you can do whatever you want without consequences." Jake's face flushed red. "You got some nerve talking to me like that." "I've got more than nerve," Samuel replied quietly. "I've got experience dealing with men like you. And I'm telling you now, for your own good, that you need to find someone else to harass." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice. The same kind of advice you gave me a few weeks ago." Jake took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. "Maybe you need a more direct lesson in how things work around here." Samuel didn't move, but something in his eyes changed. For just a moment, Henry Walsh caught a glimpse of something that made him understand why Samuel Running Bear had never seemed afraid of Jake Morrison and his friends. "You're welcome to try," Samuel said softly. "But you should know that I've faced down men who make you look like a schoolboy playing at being tough. So if you're determined to take this further, you'd better be prepared for the consequences." The barbershop fell silent, except for the ticking of Henry's wall clock. Jake stared at Samuel, trying to gauge whether the Cherokee was bluffing. What he saw in those dark eyes made him realize that Samuel Running Bear was not bluffing at all. After what felt like an eternity, Jake forced a laugh and stepped back. "You ain't worth the trouble, Cherokee, but this ain't over between us." "Yes, it is," Samuel replied. "It's over right now, if you're smart enough to let it be." Jake stormed out of the barbershop, leaving Samuel alone with Henry Walsh. The barber was shaking slightly as he began cleaning up his equipment. "I appreciate what you did for that boy," Henry said quietly. "That was right decent of you." Samuel nodded. "No child should be treated that way." "Jake Morrison's got a mean streak," Henry continued. "Always has, even when he was a kid. His daddy tried to beat it out of him, but it never took." "Some men are born angry," Samuel observed. "And some choose to stay that way." Henry looked at him curiously. "You don't seem like the kind of man who'd choose to stay angry, even though you'd have more reason than most." Samuel smiled slightly. "Anger's like a poison. It hurts the person carrying it more than anyone else." "That's wise words," Henry said, "though I got a feeling Jake Morrison ain't wise enough to understand them." Samuel left the barbershop knowing that his confrontation with Jake had probably made things worse rather than better. Men like Jake didn't back down from challenges. They just looked for other ways to prove their dominance. Samuel expected that the harassment would escalate, and he began preparing accordingly. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Samuel thought about the boy he had helped in the barbershop. The child had reminded him of himself at that age, frightened, displaced, looking for any opportunity to earn a few coins. Samuel made a mental note to find the boy and see if there was any work he could offer around the ranch. As darkness settled over the valley, Samuel went inside and checked his weapons one more time. He hoped it wouldn't come to violence, but experience had taught him that hope alone was rarely enough to prevent trouble from finding those who were determined to cause it. The Cherokee mark on his door caught the moonlight as he closed it behind him, a silent reminder of all the battles he had fought and all the wisdom he had gained in 53 years of life. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring, and Samuel Running Bear would be ready for it. The escalation Samuel had expected came 3 days after the incident in the barber shop, but not in the way he had anticipated. Instead of a direct confrontation, Jake Morrison and his friends decided to strike at what they believed would hurt Samuel most, his livelihood. It started with his water supply. Samuel's ranch depended on a small creek that ran along the eastern border of his property. The stream provided water for his cattle, irrigation for his crops, and the only reliable water source for miles around. Someone had built a makeshift dam upstream, diverting most of the water flow away from Samuel's land. Samuel discovered the problem early in the morning when he went to check on his cattle. The creek, which normally ran clear and strong, had been reduced to a muddy trickle. His cattle were already showing signs of distress, clustering around the remaining pools of water and lowing anxiously. Following the creek upstream, Samuel found the dam about half a mile beyond his property line. It was a crude but effective construction of logs, stones, and mud that had been built across the narrowest point of the creek bed. The diverted water was flowing through a newly dug channel that led toward Jake Morrison's ranch. Samuel studied the dam carefully, noting the fresh axe marks on the logs and the still wet mud that had been used to seal the gaps. This had been done recently, probably during the night. He also noticed horse tracks in the soft earth around the construction site, at least 4 different horses based on the hoof prints. The location of the dam was cleverly chosen. It sat just across the boundary line on public land, which meant that technically no laws had been broken. The land belonged to the federal government, and anyone had the right to make use of the water that flowed through it. Of course, common courtesy and unwritten agreements usually prevented such conflicts, but Jake Morrison was apparently not concerned with courtesy. Samuel knew he could tear down the dam easily enough, but he also knew that would only lead to an endless cycle of destruction and rebuilding. Worse, it might give Jake an excuse to escalate to more serious forms of sabotage. Instead, Samuel decided to pursue a different approach. He rode into town that afternoon and paid a visit to the land office, where he spoke with Thomas Mitchell, the federal land agent who managed the territory's public lands. Mitchell was a fair-minded man in his 60s who had seen enough conflicts over water rights to recognize the pattern of what was happening. "Mr. Running Bear," Mitchell said after Samuel explained the situation, "I'm sorry to hear about your troubles. Unfortunately, you're right that the dam is on public land, which means I can't simply order it removed." "I understand," Samuel replied, "but I was hoping you might have some advice on how to handle this situation properly." Mitchell leaned back in his chair and studied Samuel thoughtfully. "Well, there are legal channels you could pursue. You could file a complaint alleging that the dam is causing environmental damage or interfering with the natural flow of the water. That would trigger an investigation, and if we found merit in your complaint, we could order the dam removed." "How long would that take?" Samuel asked. "Several weeks, maybe months," Mitchell admitted. "Government investigations move slowly, especially when they involve water rights. In the meantime, your cattle would still be without adequate water." Samuel nodded. He had expected as much. Legal solutions were rarely quick enough to deal with immediate problems. "There's another option," Mitchell continued. "You could apply for a permit to build your own water improvement project on the public land. A properly designed channel or retention pond that would restore the natural flow to your property. Would that permit be approved quickly?" Mitchell smiled slightly. "It might be, especially if the proposed project would benefit the overall watershed and restore the natural balance that's been disrupted." Samuel understood. Mitchell was giving him a way to solve his problem legally, while also sending a message to Jake Morrison that his harassment tactics would not go unchallenged. "I'd like to apply for that permit," Samuel said. "I'll draw up the paperwork," Mitchell replied. "You can start work as soon as I approve it, which should be sometime tomorrow morning." That evening, Samuel began gathering the materials he would need for his project. He had learned water management techniques during his years of military service, working on irrigation projects and river crossings in various territories. What Jake Morrison didn't realize was that Samuel's water improvement project would not only restore the flow to his own property, but would actually increase the overall volume of water available to all the ranches in the area. The next morning, Samuel loaded his wagon with tools, lumber, and rope, and headed back to the creek. He found Jake Morrison and Tom Bradley waiting for him near the dam they had built. Well, Jake said as Samuel's wagon approached. "Come to admire our handiwork, Cherokee?" "Actually, I came to do some work of my own," Samuel replied, pulling a folded document from his shirt pocket. I have a permit from the land office to build a water management project on this section of public land. Jake snatched the permit and read it quickly, his face growing redder with each line. This is some kind of trick. No trick, Samuel said. Just a legal solution to a problem. Tom Bradley squinted at the document. What kind of water management project? Samuel began unloading his tools. I'm going to build a proper channel system that will ensure adequate water flow to all the downstream users, while also creating better retention and filtration. You can't just tear down our dam, Jake protested. I don't need to tear it down, Samuel replied. I'm going to build around it. And that's exactly what he did. Working steadily through the morning, Samuel constructed a series of channels and small retention pools that redirected the water flow in a way that bypassed Jake's crude dam entirely. The design was ingenious. It actually collected more water than had been flowing through the original creek bed and distributed it more efficiently downstream. Jake and Tom watched in growing frustration as Samuel's project took shape. They had expected him to simply tear down their dam, which would have given them an excuse to retaliate. Instead, he was solving the problem in a way that made their sabotage irrelevant, while also demonstrating knowledge and skills they hadn't expected him to possess. Where do you learn to do this kind of work? Tom finally asked. Here and there, Samuel replied without looking up from the channel he was digging. By noon, Samuel's water management system was complete and functioning. The creek was flowing at an even higher volume than before, with multiple channels ensuring that water reached all the downstream properties. Jake's dam was still there, but it was now just an irrelevant pile of logs and stones beside the main flow. This ain't over, Jake said as he and Tom prepared to ride back to town. It could be, Samuel replied. Anytime you want it to be. But Samuel was right to think that Jake wouldn't give up easily. The failure of the water sabotage only made Jake more determined to find a way to drive Samuel from the valley. He began recruiting other ranchers, spreading stories about Samuel's unnatural knowledge and suggesting that the Cherokee was somehow cheating or using unfair advantages. Unfortunately for Jake, most of the other ranchers in the valley had been watching Samuel's work with growing respect rather than suspicion. They had seen him handle difficult situations with skill and patience, and they were impressed by his water management project, which had actually improved conditions for everyone in the area. Jim Patterson, whose ranch was downstream from Samuel's, made a point of riding over to thank him for the improved water flow. Don't know how you knew to build it that way, Patterson said, but my cattle have never had such consistent water. Even during last month's dry spell, the flow stayed strong. Sarah Turner, widow of a rancher who had died the previous winter, brought Samuel a home-cooked meal and told him how grateful she was for his help with her son's infected wound. Dr. Foster said that poultice you made saved Billy's arm, maybe even his life. I don't know how we can ever thank you enough. Even Henry Walsh, the barber, began defending Samuel when Jake's friends made their usual complaints about the Cherokee rancher. Man's got more skill and knowledge than the rest of us put together, Henry would say. And he's decent folk, which is more than I can say for some people in this town. These positive opinions made Jake's recruitment efforts largely unsuccessful. Most of the established ranchers were not interested in harassing someone who had proven himself to be a good neighbor and a skilled landowner. The few who might have been sympathetic to Jake's cause were put off by his increasingly crude rhetoric and obvious jealousy. Frustrated by his lack of support, Jake decided to take matters into his own hands. If he couldn't turn the community against Samuel through words, he would have to find more direct methods of persuasion. The escalation began with Samuel's cattle. Someone had been driving them onto other people's property during the night, creating conflicts with neighboring ranchers and making Samuel look like a careless owner. The first time it happened, Samuel simply apologized to his neighbor and drove his cattle back home, assuming it was an accident. But when it happened 3 more times in a single week, Samuel knew it was deliberate. The cattle were being driven through gaps in the fence that appeared to have been cut during the night, and the tracks showed that horsemen had deliberately herded the animals onto adjoining properties. Samuel began staying up at night, watching his property from concealed positions. On the 4th night, he saw them coming, 4 riders moving quietly through the darkness, driving about a dozen of his cattle toward a gap in the fence that bordered the Patterson ranch. Samuel could have confronted them directly, but he chose a different approach. Instead of stopping the cattle rustling, he followed the raiders back toward town, staying far enough behind to avoid detection, but close enough to keep them in sight. What he discovered confirmed his suspicions. The four riders were Jake Morrison, Tom Bradley, Pete Lawson, and Rick Coleman. They had been systematically harassing him for weeks, escalating from simple pranks to more serious sabotage. Samuel also noticed something else during his nighttime surveillance. The four men were not the skilled outdoorsmen they pretended to be. They made noise when they should have been silent, left obvious tracks when they could have hidden their passage, and generally showed all the signs of amateurs trying to do work they didn't understand. This gave Samuel an idea. Instead of confronting them directly or reporting them to the law, he decided to use their own incompetence against them. Over the next few nights, Samuel began laying a trap. First, he moved his most valuable cattle to a different pasture, one that was closer to his house and easier to protect. Then he put his oldest and most stubborn animals in the field that Jake and his friends had been targeting. These were cattle that would not be easily driven and would make a lot of noise if anyone tried to move them. Next, Samuel prepared a series of surprises for anyone who tried to enter his property illegally. He strung thin wires at ankle height across the paths the raiders had been using, positioned to trip horses and riders in the darkness. He also set up a series of pots and pans in the trees, rigged to fall and make noise if anyone disturbed the carefully arranged trip lines. Finally, Samuel alerted Jim Patterson and two other neighboring ranchers about what had been happening. He didn't ask them to take sides or get involved in the conflict, but he made sure they knew that if they heard unusual sounds coming from his property during the night, it would be because someone was trying to steal his cattle. The trap was sprung 2 nights later. Jake and his friends arrived around midnight, confident after several successful raids. But this time, everything went wrong for them. Tom Bradley's horse was the first to hit one of Samuel's tripwires. The animal stumbled and threw its rider, sending Tom tumbling into the brush with a series of crashes and curses. His shouts spooked the cattle, who began running in all directions instead of moving obediently toward the fence gap. Pete Lawson, trying to control the panicking cattle, rode directly into Samuel's hanging pots and pans. The resulting cacophony of metal crashing and clanging could be heard for miles, waking up half the valley and sending the remaining cattle into a complete frenzy. Rick Coleman, the youngest and most nervous of the group, decided that discretion was the better part of valor and attempted to retreat quickly. Unfortunately, he chose a path that led directly into another tripwire, which brought down his horse and sent him sliding face first into a muddy creek bank. Jake Morrison, seeing his carefully planned raid falling apart around him, tried to maintain control of the situation by shouting orders at his companions. This only added to the noise and confusion, ensuring that anyone within 5 miles would know exactly where the disturbance was coming from. Samuel watched the chaos from a concealed position near his house, making mental notes about everything that was happening. When he was satisfied that the raiders had thoroughly incriminated themselves, he fired 3 shots into the air, a prearranged signal to his neighbors that the cattle thieves had been caught in the act. Within 20 minutes, Jim Patterson, Dr. Foster, and Henry Walsh had all arrived at Samuel's ranch, along with several other men from town who had heard the commotion. They found Jake and his friends covered in mud, nursing various minor injuries, and trying unsuccessfully to explain why they were on Samuel's property in the middle of the night, surrounded by scattered cattle. "Evening, gentlemen," Samuel said as he emerged from the darkness, his rifle held casually, but ready. "I believe you'll find these 4 men were attempting to steal my cattle." Jake tried to bluff his way out of the situation. "We weren't stealing nothing. We were just trying to help drive your cattle back onto your land after they got loose." "Funny way of helping," Jim Patterson observed, looking at the cut fence and the obvious evidence of the failed raid. "Seems like they were trying to drive them off your land, not onto it." Dr. Foster, who had some experience with legal matters, examined the scene carefully. "Samuel, do you want to press charges against these men?" Samuel looked at Jake and his 3 companions, all of whom were muddy, disheveled, and clearly humiliated by their failure. "I think they've learned their lesson," he said finally, "as long as this is the end of their midnight visits to my property." Jake glared at him with undisguised hatred. "This ain't over, Cherokee." "Yes, it is," Samuel replied firmly, "because if there are any more problems with my cattle, or my water, or anything else on my property, I'll know exactly who to blame. And next time, I won't be so understanding." Henry Walsh stepped forward. "Jake, I think you and your friends better head home and think real careful about what you're doing. Samuel here has been nothing but a good neighbor to everyone in this valley, and most folks are getting tired of your nonsense. Most folks don't know what they're dealing with, Jake muttered. But they will. They'll see what he really is. Samuel met Jake steadily. They'll see exactly what I've always been, a rancher trying to live peacefully and mind his own business. The question is, what will they see when they look at you? As the crowd dispersed and the four failed raiders rode back toward town, Samuel felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He had successfully defended his property and demonstrated that he would not be easily intimidated. But he also recognized that Jake Morrison's hatred had grown deeper and more dangerous. The man was not going to give up, and Samuel suspected that the next attempt at harassment would be more serious than anything that had come before. Standing on his porch as the last of his neighbors rode away, Samuel looked at the Cherokee mark carved into his door and thought about all the conflicts he had survived in his life. This valley was supposed to be a place of peace and retirement, but it seemed that some battles followed a man no matter where he went. Still, Samuel had faced worse odds before, and he was not about to be driven from his land by men who had never faced any real challenges in their lives. Jake Morrison and his friends had revealed themselves to the community as petty thieves and troublemakers. Now Samuel would wait and see if they were smart enough to accept their defeat or foolish enough to try again. Winter arrived early in Clearwater Valley that year, bringing with it a series of challenges that would test every rancher in the territory. But for Samuel Running Bear, the harsh weather was the least of his problems. Jake Morrison's humiliation during the cattle raid had only intensified his hatred, and he was now actively spreading rumors designed to turn the entire community against the Cherokee rancher. "I'm telling you, there's something unnatural about that man," Jake was saying to anyone who would listen at the Silver Dollar Saloon. "No normal person knows as much as he claims to know. And did you see how he set those traps? Like he'd done 100 times before." Most of the regular customers had grown tired of Jake's complaints, but the arrival of winter had brought new faces to town: travelers, seasonal workers, and drifters looking for temporary shelter. These strangers didn't know Samuel personally and were more susceptible to Jake's poisonous stories. Heard he was in the Army, offered a grizzled prospector who had just arrived from Colorado, could explain the trap setting. "Army don't teach you how to read water like he does," Jake replied, "or how to heal wounds with plants that ain't supposed to grow in these parts. There's Cherokee magic involved, mark my words." Tom Bradley nodded enthusiastically. "My grandmother always said you couldn't trust Indian medicine. Said it came from dark spirits." The truth was that Samuel's knowledge came from years of practical experience, military training, and Cherokee traditions that had been passed down through generations. But to men like Jake, anything they didn't understand was automatically suspicious or supernatural. The rumors began to spread beyond the saloon. At church socials and community gatherings, whispered stories circulated about Samuel's unnatural abilities. Some claimed he could predict the weather by watching birds. Others insisted he had some kind of mystical connection to his horses and cattle. A few even suggested that he had made a deal with dark forces to ensure his success as a rancher. Samuel became aware of the rumors when Martha Henderson, the general store owner, quietly warned him during one of his supply runs. "I don't believe a word of it," she said, "but I thought you should know what's being said." Samuel thanked her for the warning, but wasn't particularly surprised. He had faced similar suspicions in other places, often from people who couldn't accept that his knowledge came from legitimate sources rather than something mystical or threatening. What did concern him was the effect the rumors were having on some of the more superstitious members of the community. Several people who had previously been friendly now avoided eye contact when he came to town. Others crossed themselves when they saw him, as if his mere presence was somehow dangerous. The young Mexican boy Samuel had helped in the barber shop, whose name was Miguel, had been working odd jobs around Samuel's ranch for several weeks. Miguel's family had recently arrived in the valley, fleeing violence in their home region, and the boy was trying to earn money to help support his siblings and sick mother. Samuel had taken a liking to Miguel, who reminded him of himself at that age, displaced, struggling, but determined to make an honest living. The boy was quick to learn, worked hard without complaining, and showed a natural aptitude for handling animals. One afternoon, as they were repairing fence posts in the cold wind, Miguel looked worried. "Señor Samuel," he said hesitantly, "people in town, they say things about you. Bad things. Samuel continued working, but listened carefully. What kind of things, Miguel? They say you are, how do you say, Brujo? A sorcerer. They say you make magic to hurt people who cross you. Samuel set down his hammer and looked at the boy seriously. What do you think, Miguel? Do I seem like a sorcerer to you? Miguel shook his head emphatically. No, senor. You are a good man. You help people. You help me when nobody else would. Then, you understand something that some adults have forgotten, Samuel said. The truth about a person comes from their actions, not from stories other people tell. But, senor, Miguel continued, some people, they are very angry. They say things should be done to make you leave. This was what Samuel had been afraid of. Jake's rumor campaign was not just affecting his reputation. It was potentially creating a dangerous situation where some people might feel justified in taking action against him. That evening, Samuel had an unexpected visitor. Dr. Michael Foster rode up to the ranch, just as Samuel was finishing his evening chores. The doctor looked tired and worried, and Samuel could tell he had something serious on his mind. Evening, Samuel, Dr. Foster said as he dismounted. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. Not at all, doctor. Coffee's still hot, if you'd like some. They settled on Samuel's porch despite the cold, both men wrapping their hand around warm coffee mugs. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Finally, Dr. Foster spoke. Samuel, I need to tell you something. There's been talk in town about forming a committee to address what some folks are calling the Cherokee problem. Samuel wasn't surprised, but it still sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the weather. Who's behind it? Jake Morrison, mainly, though he's got Tom Bradley and a few others stirring up support. They're claiming you're a danger to the community. Based on what evidence? Dr. Foster shook his head. No evidence at all, just rumors and superstition. They're playing on people's fears, making them think you're somehow unnatural or threatening. Samuel stared out at his pasture, where his cattle were gathered near the barn for warmth. How many people are supporting this committee idea? Not as many as Jake would like, Dr. Foster admitted. Most of the established families think it's nonsense. But there are enough newcomers and troublemakers to make it dangerous. If they get organized. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Samuel had seen what could happen when fear and prejudice combined with group hysteria. Innocent people could be driven from their homes, or worse. Doctor, Samuel said quietly, there's something you should know about me. Something that might help you understand why Jake Morrison's accusations are so wrong. Dr. Foster leaned forward, listening intently as Samuel began to speak about his past. For the next hour, Samuel told the doctor about his military service, his work with various government agencies, and the real source of his knowledge and skills. I've spent most of my adult life serving this country, Samuel concluded. I fought beside soldiers from every state and territory, saved the lives of men who might have looked down on me in civilian life, and earned decorations that most people never even hear about. Everything I know, everything I can do, I learned through honest service and hard experience. Dr. Foster was quiet for a long time after Samuel finished speaking. Why haven't you told people about your military service? He finally asked. Samuel smiled sadly. Would it matter? To men like Jake Morrison, I'll always be just a Cherokee who doesn't know his place. My service record won't change that. It might change how other people see you, though. People who are on the fence about these rumors. Maybe, Samuel said. But I've never been one to parade my accomplishments. I prefer to let my actions speak for themselves. Dr. Foster stood up to leave, then paused. Samuel, if this committee thing goes forward, if they try to force you to leave, you won't face it alone. There are good people in this valley who know right from wrong. I appreciate that, Doctor, but I hope it won't come to that. After Dr. Foster left, Samuel sat on his porch for a long time, thinking about his options. He could pack up and leave, avoiding a confrontation that might turn violent. He could stay and fight, using his military skills to defend his property. Or he could find a way to expose Jake Morrison and his followers for what they really were. The decision was made for him 3 days later when Miguel arrived at the ranch in a state of panic. The boy had been beaten, his clothes torn, and his face bruised. He was crying as he stumbled up to Samuel's front door. Miguel. Samuel caught the boy before he could fall. What happened? Who did this to you? Through his tears, Miguel told a story that made Samuel's blood run cold. Jake Morrison and his friends had cornered Miguel in town, accusing him of working for a sorcerer and demanding that he stop coming to Samuel's ranch. They said, if I don't stop working for you, they will hurt my family, Miguel sobbed. They said you are devil, and anyone who helps you will be punished. Samuel helped Miguel into the house and began treating his injuries. As he worked, his mind was racing. This had gone far beyond harassment or intimidation. Jake and his friend were now threatening children and innocent families. That changed everything. Miguel, Samuel said gently as he cleaned a cut on the boy's cheek, I want you to go home to your family. Stay there until this is resolved. But, Senor, I need the work. My mother, she is still sick, and I'll make sure your family has what they need, Samuel interrupted. But I can't let you get hurt because of your association with me. After Miguel left, Samuel went to his bedroom and opened a trunk that had been gathering dust in the corner. Inside were items he had hoped never to need again. His military medals, service records, and official commendations from various commanders he had served under. But, more importantly, the trunk contained something else. Wrapped carefully in oiled cloth was a letter of recommendation written by General Philip Sheridan himself, praising Samuel's service and character. The letter specifically mentioned Samuel's work in maintaining peace between diverse communities and his invaluable contributions to the security and development of the Western Territories. Samuel had received the letter after his final military assignment, when he had successfully negotiated a peace treaty between two feuding tribes that had been raiding settlements throughout Montana. General Sheridan had personally thanked him for preventing what could have become a much larger and more destructive conflict. The letter was more than just a testimonial to Samuel's service. It was written on official War Department letterhead and bore the general's personal seal. In a territory where federal authority was still the ultimate law, such a document carried enormous weight. Samuel also retrieved another item from the trunk, a small wooden box that contained the Cherokee Nation medal he had been awarded for his service as a translator and negotiator. The medal was made of silver and bore symbols that told the story of his contributions to peace between his people and the United States government. That evening, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for Jake Morrison's committee to come to him, he would take the fight to them. But he would not use violence or threats. Instead, he would use the truth, a weapon that Jake Morrison and his friend were completely unprepared to face. The next morning, Samuel dressed carefully in his best clothes and rode into town. But instead of going to the general store or the barber shop as usual, he went directly to the courthouse where Judge William Harrison held court twice a week. Judge Harrison was a fair-minded man in his 70s who had been appointed to serve the territory by President Grant himself. He had a reputation for honesty and legal expertise that had earned him the respect of everyone in the region, regardless of their political affiliations. "Good morning, Your Honor," Samuel said as he was shown into the judge's chambers. "I apologize for arriving without an appointment, but I have a legal matter that requires immediate attention." Judge Harrison looked up from the documents he had been reviewing. "Good morning, Mr. Running Bear. Please have a seat. What can I do for you?" Samuel placed his military documents on the judge's desk. "I understand that certain individuals in town are organizing a committee to address what they're calling the Cherokee problem. I believe this committee plans to take actions that would violate both territorial law and federal statutes regarding the rights of military veterans." Judge Harrison examined the documents carefully, his eyebrows rising as he read through Samuel's service record and General Sheridan's letter of recommendation. When he finished, he looked up at Samuel with new understanding. "Mr. Running Bear," the judge said slowly, "these are extraordinary credentials. May I ask why you've never mentioned your military service before?" "I came here seeking peace and quiet, Your Honor. I had hoped that my service to this country had earned me the right to live without harassment based on my race or background." Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "It certainly should have. These documents make it clear that you've served this nation with distinction and honor. Any action taken against you based solely on your ethnic background would be not only morally wrong, but legally actionable." "That's what I was hoping you would say, Your Honor." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. "Mr. Running Bear, I think it's time that certain members of our community were reminded that this is a nation of laws, not mob rule. Would you be willing to appear at a public hearing where these matters could be discussed openly?" Samuel nodded. "I would be honored to do so, Your Honor." "Excellent. I'll schedule a public hearing for this Saturday afternoon. I'll also make sure that Mr. Morrison and his associates are officially notified that their planned committee activities are under judicial review." As Samuel left the courthouse, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time since arriving in Clearwater Valley, he had taken the offensive rather than simply defending himself. Jake Morrison and his friends were about to discover that Samuel Running Bear was not the helpless target they had imagined him to be. But Samuel knew that exposing the truth about his background was only the first step. Jake Morrison was driven by hatred that went beyond logic or reason, and men like that didn't give up easily just because they had been proven wrong. The real confrontation was still to come, and Samuel suspected it would test everything he had learned about both warfare and peacemaking during his long and eventful life. Saturday afternoon arrived cold and gray, with threatening clouds gathering over the mountains that surrounded Clearwater Valley. The courthouse had never seen such a crowd, as word of the public hearing had spread quickly through the community. People had come from ranches and homesteads dozens of miles away, drawn by curiosity about the Cherokee rancher and the accusations that had been made against him. Jake Morrison arrived early with Tom Bradley, Pete Lawson, and Rick Coleman, along with a handful of supporters who had bought into their rumors and fears. They clustered together near the front of the courtroom, their faces set with the confidence of men who believed they were about to be vindicated. But as more people filed into the courthouse, Jake began to realize that public opinion might not be as firmly on his side as he had assumed. Jim Patterson was there, along with Dr. Foster, Henry Walsh, and Martha Henderson. These were respected members of the community, and their presence suggested that Samuel Running Bear had more support than Jake had realized. Even more concerning to Jake was the presence of several strangers, men in military uniforms who had ridden into town that morning and gone directly to the courthouse. Jake didn't know who they were or why they were there, but their official bearing and serious expressions made him nervous. Judge Harrison called the hearing to order at exactly 2 o'clock. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are here today to address certain accusations and concerns that have been raised about Mr. Samuel Running Bear, a resident of this valley. It is my intention to ensure that all parties have an opportunity to present their views and that any actions taken by this community are based on facts rather than rumors or prejudice." Jake Morrison rose from his seat. "Your Honor, with respect, we're here because we have legitimate concerns about the safety and well-being of our community. This Cherokee has been involved in suspicious activities that Mr. Morrison," Judge Harrison interrupted. "You will have your opportunity to speak. But first, I believe it would be appropriate for the court to examine the facts about Mr. Running Bear's background and character." The judge gestured towards Samuel, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom. "Mr. Running Bear, would you please approach the bench?" As Samuel walked forward, Judge Harrison held up the documents that Samuel had provided. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we discuss accusations and rumors, I think you should know exactly who Samuel Running Bear is." The judge began reading from General Sheridan's letter of recommendation, his voice carrying clearly throughout the packed courtroom. As the details of Samuel's military service became known, a murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Many people had suspected that Samuel was more than he appeared to be, but none had imagined the extent of his service to their country. Mr. Running Bear served with distinction in campaigns throughout the Western Territories, Judge Harrison continued. He saved the lives of countless soldiers and civilians, prevented conflicts that could have resulted in widespread violence, and earned the respect and admiration of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. Jake Morrison's face had gone pale as the judge spoke. This was not what he had expected at all. He had been prepared to argue against a simple Cherokee rancher, not a decorated military veteran with official commendations from famous generals. But Jake was not ready to give up. As Judge Harrison finished reading the documents, Jake stood up again. "Your Honor, I don't care what he did 20 years ago. What matters is what he's doing now. And the fact remains that there's something unnatural about his abilities." "What exactly do you mean by unnatural, Mr. Morrison?" the judge asked. "He knows things he shouldn't know," Jake replied. "He can predict the weather, heal wounds that should have been fatal, and train animals in ways that no normal person could manage." "It ain't Christian, Your Honor." At this point, one of the uniformed strangers stood up. "Your Honor, may I address the court?" Judge Harrison nodded. "Please identify yourself." "Colonel James Mitchell, United States Army Corps of Engineers," the man said in a crisp military voice. "I've had the honor of serving with Mr. Running Bear on several occasions, and I believe I can shed some light on his supposed unnatural abilities." The courtroom fell completely silent as Colonel Mitchell began to speak. Mr. Running Bear's knowledge of weather patterns comes from years of military service in territories where such knowledge was essential for survival. He learned to read cloud formations, wind patterns, and animal behavior because lives depended on accurate weather prediction. The colonel continued, methodically explaining each of Jake's accusations. Samuel's medical knowledge came from training he had received as a military scout and his study of Cherokee traditional medicine. His ability with animals was the result of techniques he had learned from master trainers during his service with cavalry units. Furthermore, Colonel Mitchell added, Mr. Running Bear's water management project, which some have characterized as mysterious, is actually based on engineering principles that are taught at West Point. I personally trained him in these techniques during the construction of Fort Apache in Arizona Territory. Dr. Foster stood up. "Your Honor, may I also speak?" "Of course, Doctor. I've examined the boy that Mr. Running Bear treated for infection," Dr. Foster said. "The poultice he used contained plants that are well known for their medicinal properties. Any physician with knowledge of herbal medicine would recognize the ingredients. There was nothing supernatural about the treatment, just knowledge and skill applied competently." Jim Patterson was the next to stand. "Your Honor, I'd like to say something about that water management project. Mr. Running Bear's work didn't just help his own ranch. It improved water flow for everyone downstream. My cattle have never had more reliable water, and I've seen other ranchers benefit as well. If that's unnatural, then I wish more people were unnatural in the same way." Henry Walsh, the barber, stood up and looked directly at Jake Morrison. "Jake, I was there when you grabbed that Mexican boy and threatened him. I saw Mr. Running Bear stand up for a child who was being bullied. If you want to talk about character, let's talk about the character it takes to protect someone who can't protect himself." Jake felt control of the situation slipping away from him completely. The crowd was clearly turning against him, and even some of his own supporters were beginning to look uncomfortable. But he was too angry and too proud to back down. "This is all beside the point," Jake said loudly. "I don't care how many fancy letters he's got or how many people want to defend him. The fact is, he don't belong here. This valley was built by white Christian families, and we got the right to decide who else gets to stay." The silence that followed Jake's outburst was deafening. Judge Harrison's expression grew stern, and several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Colonel Mitchell stood up again. "Mr. Morrison, Mr. Running Bear, and his people were living on this land long before your ancestors arrived. He has earned the right to live here through service to this nation, just as you claim that right through birth. The difference is that his claim is based on merit and sacrifice, while yours appears to be based solely on prejudice." Jake's face flushed red with anger. "I won't be lectured by some outsider who don't understand how things work around here." "Then perhaps you'll listen to someone who does understand," said a new voice from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned to see an elderly man walking slowly toward the front. He was tall and distinguished, with white hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Many people in the courtroom recognized him immediately. It was Colonel William Morrison, Jake's own grandfather and one of the most respected men in the entire territory. Jake's face went white as his grandfather approached. Colonel Morrison had been one of the original settlers of Clearwater Valley, a Civil War veteran who had built his ranch through hard work and fair dealing. He was also a man who had no tolerance for bigotry or cowardice. "Grandfather," Jake stammered, "what are you doing here?" "I came to see if the stories I'd heard about my grandson were true," Colonel Morrison replied, his voice carrying a disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. "I'm ashamed to say they appear to be." The old colonel looked around the courtroom, his gaze settling on Samuel. "Mr. Running Bear, I owe you an apology on behalf of my family. My grandson has brought dishonor to our name with his behavior." Samuel stood and nodded respectfully. "Colonel Morrison, every family has members who choose different paths. The actions of one person don't reflect on the rest." "That's generous of you," Colonel Morrison replied. "But generosity doesn't excuse the harm that's been done." He turned to face his grandson. "Jake, you and your friends have spent months